The shovel felt heavier than it should have in Robert Mitchell's calloused hands. At 52, he'd dug thousands of holes across his 180 acres, but this one was different. This one was meant to be his last. The October rain had turned the Nebraska soil into thick, unforgiving mud that clung to his boots and made each movement feel like swimming through concrete. Gray clouds hung low over Cedar Valley, matching the weight that had settled in his chest for the past 8 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bob paused, wiping rain from his weathered face with the back of his sleeve. The corn had been harvested 3 weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but stubble and the hollow echo of what this place used to be. What it used to mean. The Mitchell family farm had been in his bloodline for 4 generations, but it would end with him. Tonight, if he could find the courage. He'd already written the letters, sealed them in envelopes that sat on his kitchen table next to the stack of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices. One for his brother in Denver, who'd stopped calling months ago. One for Dr. Rodriguez at the hospital, thanking her for trying to save Sarah and Tommy when the accident happened. And one for whoever would find him, apologizing for the mess. The wind picked up, cutting through his worn flannel shirt and sending a shiver down his spine. Bob looked toward the old red barn where his grandfather had taught him to milk cows, where his father had shown him how to fix tractors with nothing but determination and spare wire, where he'd taught his own son Tommy to throw a baseball last spring before everything went wrong. The barn doors hung open now, swaying in the wind like broken wings. 8 months. That's how long it had been since the semi-truck ran the red light in town, since the world went silent in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sarah had been driving Tommy to his Little League game, taking the route through downtown that she'd driven 1,000 times before. The other driver never even hit his brakes. The police said they died instantly, that they didn't suffer. Bob wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. He thrust the shovel into the ground again, feeling the metal scrape against something. Hard beneath the surface, probably another rock. This field was full of them, had always been the most difficult to work. That's why he'd chosen it. Seemed fitting somehow, to end where things had always been hardest. Bob had always been a man of routine. Wake at dawn, coffee black and bitter, check the animals, tend the fields. But since the funeral, routine had become survival. Each day was a mountain to climb just to reach nightfall, and each night was a canyon to cross just to see morning. The farm that had once felt like home now felt like a museum of memories he couldn't escape. The insurance money had covered the burial costs, but barely. Sarah's medical bills from her cancer treatment 3 years earlier had already drained their savings. The bank had been patient at first, understanding even, but patience didn't pay mortgages. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 6 months after the accident. Bob had read it 3 times before the words made sense, then folded it carefully and placed it with the others. He'd tried to keep going, tried to honor what Sarah would have wanted. She'd always been the strong one, the one who found solutions when Bob could only see problems. She would have figured out a way to save the farm, to start over, to find meaning in the wreckage. But Sarah wasn't here, and Bob had discovered something terrible about himself in her absence. Without her steady voice and Tommy's laughter filling the house, he was just a man standing in an empty field, holding tools he no longer remembered how to use. The neighbors had tried to help at first. The Hendersons from the next farm over had brought casseroles and offers to help with the harvest. Mrs. Chun from the feed store had quietly extended credit when Bob's account ran low. Even Sheriff Williams had stopped by a few times, not on official business, just to check in. But grief had a way of making kindness feel like pity, and pity was the one thing Bob couldn't stomach. He'd started avoiding town, driving the long way around to skip Main Street, where he might run into familiar faces wearing expressions of careful concern. He'd stopped answering his phone when his brother called from Denver, stopped opening mail. That wasn't bills or legal notices. The world had kept spinning, but Bob had simply stepped off and watched it go. The shovel hit the hard object again, this time with enough force to send vibrations up through his arms. Bob knelt in the mud, pushing aside the wet earth with his hands. His fingers found something smooth and curved, like the edge of a large stone. He dug around it, expecting to unearth another of the countless rocks that had plagued this field since his grandfather's time. Instead, what emerged was the corner of something wooden. Old wood, weathered and gray, but definitely man-made. Bob frowned, sitting back on his heels despite the mud soaking through his jeans. In all his years working this land, he'd never found anything like this in the back field. His father had never mentioned anything buried here, and his grandfather had been dead 20 years. Curiosity, that old familiar friend he'd thought was buried with his family, stirred somewhere in his chest. Bob began digging with more purpose now, following the edge of whatever lay beneath the soil. As he worked, the rain began to fall harder, turning the earth into a slippery mess that clung to everything it touched. The wooden structure was larger than he'd expected. What he'd taken for a stone was actually the corner of what appeared to be some kind of door or hatch, set horizontally into the ground. The wood was thick, probably oak, and while it was weathered, it seemed solid enough. Bob cleared away more dirt, revealing metal hinges black with age and a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. He rocked back on his heels, studying his discovery. It looked like the entrance to an old root cellar or storm shelter, the kind his great-grandfather might have built during the Depression. Bob had heard stories about such things, hidden storage spaces where families kept food during hard times, or took shelter during the tornadoes that occasionally tore across the Nebraska plains. But no one had ever mentioned one on the Mitchell farm. The rain was coming down steadily now, turning the freshly disturbed earth into soup. Bob should have gone back to the house, should have waited for better weather to investigate whatever this was. But something about the discovery had shifted something inside him, had wakened a part of his mind that had been sleeping for months. For the first time since the accident, he was curious about something other than his own pain. He grabbed the rusted handle and pulled. Nothing happened. Years of rain and settling earth had sealed the door tight. Bob dug around the edges, clearing away more dirt and debris. He could see now that this was definitely some kind of underground chamber, probably built when this was still frontier country. The craftsmanship was crude but solid, the kind of work done by men who had to make things last because there was no hardware store down the road. Bob tried the handle again, throwing his weight into it. This time he felt something give, heard the groaning protest of old wood and metal being forced back into service. The door shifted slightly, enough to show that it wasn't completely stuck. He worked at it patiently, the way his father had taught him to work with stubborn machinery. "Don't force what you can coax," the old man used to say. Gradually, with a sound like a sigh that had been held for decades, the door began to open. Bob pulled it back carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in his hands. But the old wood held, revealing a dark opening that disappeared into the earth below. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The smell hit him first. Not the musty odor of old earth and forgotten spaces that he'd expected, but something else. Something that made him step back instinctively, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. It was the smell of people, of human habitation, fresh and immediate and impossible. Bob fumbled for his phone, turning on its flashlight and directing the beam into the opening. What he saw made him drop to his knees in the mud, made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped the phone. There were children down there. 7 of them, huddled together in what appeared to be a small underground room. Their faces were pale and streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with fear and something that might have been hope. They were alive, clearly breathing, but they looked exhausted and terrified. The oldest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 12, was holding the smallest, a little boy who might have been 6 or 7. Between them were 5 other children of various ages, all dressed in clothes that had once been clean but were now dirty and wrinkled. They stared up at Bob through the opening, and he could see in their faces the particular kind of fear that comes from having given up hope and then suddenly finding it again. For a moment, nobody moved. Bob knelt there in the rain, looking down at 7 impossible children who had no business being in an abandoned cellar on his property. They looked back at him, these small faces that seemed to glow in the harsh light of his phone's flashlight. The rain continued to fall, pattering against the wooden door and running in rivulets into the dark space below. Then the oldest girl spoke, her voice hoarse and small but carrying clearly in the still air. "Please," she said, "please help us." And just like that, Bob Mitchell's world shifted again. But this time, instead of everything falling apart, it felt like something was being put back together. He didn't know who these children were or how they'd come to be buried in his field. He didn't know how long they'd been down there or what had happened to put them there. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that finding them wasn't an accident. "It's okay," he called down to them, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm going to get you out of there. You're safe now." The girl holding the smallest boy started to cry then, not from fear but from relief. And Bob, who hadn't cried since the day they lowered Sarah and Tommy into the ground, felt his own eyes burning with tears he'd thought were all used up. The shovel lay forgotten in the mud beside him. The letters on his kitchen table would have to wait. Bob Mitchell had work to do, and for the first time in 8 months, it was work that mattered. Work that might save something instead of ending it. He pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. As he waited for the dispatcher to answer, he looked back down at the 7 faces watching him from below. They were depending on him now. These children who had somehow found their way into the darkest corner of his land and his life. And maybe, just maybe, he was exactly what they needed. Just like they might be exactly what he needed too. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone with professional calm. But Bob could hear the disbelief creeping in as he tried to explain what he'd found. 7 children in an underground shelter on his property. Yes, they appeared to be alive and unharmed. No, he had no idea how they'd gotten there or who they were. The dispatcher promised emergency vehicles would be there within 20 minutes. But 20 minutes felt like a lifetime when he was looking down at 7 pairs of frightened eyes. Bob pocketed his phone and knelt closer to the opening. The space below was cramped, maybe 8 feet square, and barely tall enough for the oldest child to stand upright. The walls appeared to be lined with old stone, and he could make out what looked like shelves along one side, though it was too dark to see clearly. The children were pressed together in the center of the space, sitting on what appeared to be old blankets. "What are your names?" Bob called down, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the urgency hammering in his chest. The oldest girl, the one who'd spoken first, shifted the smaller boy in her arms. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This is Grace, she's 6. She nodded toward the others. "That's Lucas and Sophia and Jacob and Noah and Lily. 7 names. 7 children who shouldn't exist, shouldn't be here, shouldn't be real." Bob ran through what he knew about missing children, about Amber Alerts and news reports. There had been something on the radio a few days ago, hadn't there? Something about a transport van, but he'd been too lost in his own darkness to pay attention. "How long have you been down there?" he asked. Emma looked around at the others, as if checking with them before answering. 3 days, I think. Maybe 4. It's hard to tell when you can't see the sun. 3 days. The same amount of time. Bob had been planning his own ending, These children had been trapped beneath his feet. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he couldn't decide if it was cruel or miraculous. "Are any of you hurt? Do you need water?" "We found some bottles down here," Emma said, pointing to the corner where Bob could just make out the glint of plastic. "But we're pretty hungry, and Noah's been coughing a lot." Bob looked at the boy Emma had indicated, a slight kid who looked to be about 7. Even in the poor light, he could see the child's pale complexion and the way he was breathing carefully, like each breath required thought. "The ambulance is coming," Bob assured them. "We're going to get you out of there and get Noah looked at. Can you tell me how you ended up here?" The children exchanged glances, and Bob could see a conversation happening in their expressions that didn't require words. Emma finally spoke again. "We were in a van. Mrs. Patterson was driving us to our new home. But then there was an accident, and when we woke up, we were here. A van, an accident." The pieces of the radio report Bob had half heard started coming back to him. Something about a state transport vehicle that had gone missing between foster homes. A driver found unconscious, but no sign of the children who were supposed to be in her care. The authorities had been searching for days. "Mrs. Patterson was your driver?" "She takes care of kids like us," said one of the other children, a boy who looked to be about 10. Lucas, Bob thought. Kids who don't have families anymore. The words hit Bob harder than they should have. Kids who don't have families anymore. He understood that feeling better than they could know. In the distance, Bob could hear the first sirens approaching, their wailing cutting through the steady drum of rain. He felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by something he hadn't expected. Reluctance. Once the authorities arrived, these children would be taken away, returned to whatever system had been transporting them in the first place. They'd become someone else's responsibility, someone else's concern. And Bob would be alone, again with his empty house and his unanswered questions. The first vehicle to arrive was Sheriff Williams' patrol car, its red and blue lights painting the gray afternoon in urgent colors. Dan Williams had been sheriff in Cedar Valley for 15 years, had known Bob since they were kids attending. The same one-room schoolhouse that had been torn down decades ago. He was a good man, steady and fair, but Bob could see the confusion on his face as he approached through the rain. "Bob? Dispatch said you found some missing kids on your property?" Bob gestured toward the opening in the ground. 7 of them. "They've been down there for days." Sheriff Williams knelt beside the hole, shining his own flashlight into the space below. Bob watched the sheriff's face change as he took in what he was seeing. Watched the professional mask slip for just a moment to reveal the same shock Bob had felt. "Jesus," Williams muttered under his breath. Then louder, "Hey there, kids. I'm Sheriff Williams. We're going to get you out of there real soon, okay?" The ambulances arrived next, followed by the fire department's rescue truck. Within minutes, Bob's quiet field was transformed into a scene of organized chaos. EMTs and firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, setting up equipment and coordinating the rescue. Someone brought a ladder, someone else set up floodlights that turned the gray afternoon harsh and bright. Bob found himself pushed to the periphery, watching as strangers took over the care of children he'd known for less than an hour. It was the right thing, the necessary thing, but it left him feeling oddly bereft. For 20 minutes, he'd had a purpose again. For 20 minutes, he'd been needed. The children were brought up one by one, each immediately wrapped in blankets and surrounded by medical personnel. Bob watched from a distance as they were checked over, as Noah was given oxygen, as the smallest girl, Grace, was lifted onto a stretcher despite her protests that she could walk. Emma was the last to come up. As the EMTs helped her out of the underground space, she looked around until she spotted Bob standing near his truck. Their eyes met across the bustling scene, and she said something to the EMT holding her arm. The woman nodded, and Emma walked over to where Bob stood. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding us." Bob knelt down so he was at her eye level. This close, he could see that she was older than her years, carrying the kind of responsibility that childhood shouldn't have to bear. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad you're safe." Emma looked back toward the other children, now surrounded by medical equipment and official personnel. "We were starting to think nobody would find us. The opening got covered up during the storm, and we couldn't push it open from inside. How did you end up in there in the first place?" Emma's face clouded. "After the van crashed, this man found us. He said he was helping, said he knew somewhere safe we could wait until the police came. But then he locked us in there and left. We kept waiting for him to come back, but he never did." Bob felt something cold settle in his stomach. Someone had deliberately put these children in that underground space. Someone had locked them in and abandoned them. If Bob hadn't been digging in that exact spot, if he hadn't been planning what he'd been planning, they might have died down there. "Did you see what this man looked like?" Emma nodded. "He was tall, with gray hair. He had a scar on his face right here." She traced a line down her left cheek, "and he smelled like cigarettes." Before Bob could ask more questions, Sheriff Williams approached with a woman Bob didn't recognize. She was small and efficient-looking, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of clothes that suggested she spent her time in offices rather than fields. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services. She needs to ask you some questions." Janet Morrison's handshake was firm, her smile professional but warm. "Mr. Mitchell, I can't thank you enough for what you've done today. These children have been missing for 4 days. We were beginning to fear the worst." "4 days," Bob repeated. Emma said 3, maybe 4. "Time moves differently when you're scared and in the dark," Morrison said gently. "The important thing is they're safe now. Can you tell me exactly how you found them?" Bob explained about digging in the field, about discovering the wooden door, about hearing Emma's voice calling for help. He left out the part about why he'd been digging, about the letters sitting on his kitchen table. Some truths weren't meant for strangers. "And you had no idea this underground space existed?" "None. This farm's been in my family for 4 generations. If there was a storm shelter or root cellar out here, someone should have known about it." Morrison made notes on a tablet as they talked. "We'll need to have our investigators take a look at the space. And unfortunately, we'll need to treat your property as a crime scene until we understand exactly what happened here." Bob nodded, watching as the children were loaded into ambulances for transport to Cedar Valley General Hospital. Emma was in the last ambulance, and she waved at him through the rear window as it pulled away. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it hit Bob with unexpected force. As the emergency vehicles departed, the field fell quiet again. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that particular smell of wet earth and growing things. "Sheriff." Williams walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Hell of a thing, Bob, hell of a thing. Any idea who might have put them down there?" Williams shook his head. "Morrison's got people checking on anyone who might have had access to your property. Utility workers, delivery drivers, anyone who might have known about that underground space. Though honestly, I'm not sure how anyone could have known about it if you didn't." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking at the gaping hole in the ground that had changed everything. Crime scene tape now surrounded the area, fluttering in the breeze like yellow prayer flags. "You doing okay, Bob?" Williams asked quietly. "I know these past months have been rough." Bob almost told him then. Almost explained about the letters, about the shovel, about the darkness that had brought him to this field in the first place. But the words wouldn't come. "I'm managing," he said instead. Williams nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, you did a good thing today. A really good thing. Those kids owe their lives to you." After the sheriff left, Bob walked back to his house alone. The kitchen felt different somehow, smaller and stuffier than it had that morning. The letters still sat on the table where he'd left them, next to the stack of bills and the foreclosure notice. But they seemed to belong to a different person now, someone who'd existed before 7 voices called out from the darkness. Bob picked up the letters, and without reading them, carried them to the fireplace. He knelt before the cold hearth and struck a match, watching as the paper caught fire and burned. The flames were small and brief, but they felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. He made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out toward the field where the crime scene tape marked the spot where everything had changed. Tomorrow there would be investigators and reporters. There would be questions about the underground space and the man who'd trapped 7 children inside it. There would be bureaucracy and paperwork and the slow machinery of justice grinding into motion. But tonight, there were 7 children sleeping safely in hospital beds instead of huddled together in a dark hole in the ground. Tonight, Bob Mitchell was not a man who had given up on the world, but a man who had helped save a piece of it. He didn't know what came next. The farm was still failing, the bills were still unpaid, and Sarah and Tommy were still gone. But something had shifted, some fundamental equation had changed. The emptiness was still there, but it felt different now. Less like an ending and more like a pause, a breath between one movement and the next. Bob finished his sandwich and headed upstairs. To bed. For the first time in months, he didn't dread the morning. Bob woke before dawn, pulled from sleep not by his usual alarm, but by something else entirely. For a moment, lying in the darkness of his bedroom, he couldn't place what had changed. Then it came to him. He'd slept through the night without waking. Without the familiar 3 a.m. spiral into grief and regret that had plagued him for months. His body felt rested in a way that seemed foreign, almost suspicious. He dressed quickly and made coffee, standing at the kitchen window as the first pale light crept across his fields. In the distance, he could see the crime scene tape still fluttering around the hole where he'd found the children. Even from here, the bright yellow strips looked unreal against the subdued colors of autumn morning. His phone buzzed against the counter. Janet Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and Bob felt his pulse quicken. News about the children, maybe. Or questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Mr. Mitchell? I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to update you on the children's condition. How are they? Remarkably well, considering. They're all stable, though we're keeping Noah in the hospital for observation. His respiratory issues seem to be improving with treatment. The others are being discharged today. Bob found himself gripping the phone tighter. Where will they go? There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's actually why I'm calling. The children have been asking about you. Emma, especially. She's been telling everyone about the man who saved them, and she's quite insistent that she wants to thank you properly. She already thanked me. Yes, well, children process trauma differently than adults. Sometimes they fixate on their rescuer as a way of feeling safe again. I was wondering if you might be willing to visit them at the hospital. Just briefly. It might help with their emotional recovery. Bob stared out at his empty fields, at the life he'd been ready to abandon just 24 hours ago. The idea of walking into a hospital, of facing those 7 pairs of eyes again, should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something that might have been anticipation. What time? Cedar Valley General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and hope, a combination Bob had learned to hate during Sarah's final months. But today, walking through the automatic doors toward the pediatric wing, the smell didn't bring the usual wave of nausea and despair. Today it meant something different. Janet Morrison met him at the nurse's station, looking more relaxed than she had the day before. They're in the family room at the end of the hall. Fair warning, they're excited to see you. Bob followed her down a corridor lined with cheerful murals of cartoon animals and rainbows. Through open doorways, he caught glimpses of other children, other families dealing with their own crises. The pediatric wing had always been the hardest part of Sarah's treatments. Seeing sick children and knowing that his own healthy boy was at home, safe and unaware of how fragile everything really was. The family room was larger than he'd expected, with comfortable couches arranged around a television and shelves lined with books and games. 6 of the 7 children were there, scattered around the room in various states of recovery. They looked different in the hospital lighting, cleaner and brighter, but still carrying that careful wariness that Bob was beginning to recognize. Emma saw him first. She was sitting on one of the couches with Grace curled up beside her, and when Bob appeared in the doorway, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely. "You came," she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice, as if adults didn't usually keep their promises. "Of course I came." Bob stepped into the room, suddenly aware of how large he must seem to these children, how his work clothes and calloused hands marked him as different from the social workers and medical staff they were used to. The other children gathered around, him with the gravitational pull of planets drawn to a sun. Lucas, the 10-year-old boy with serious eyes. Sophia, 9 years old with tangled brown hair that someone had tried to braid. Jacob, 8 and missing his front teeth. Lily, 7 with a stubborn cowlick that defied all attempts at grooming. And little Grace, 6 years old and still clinging to Emma like a lifeline. "Where's Noah?" Bob asked. "He's still in his room with the breathing machine," Emma explained. "But he's better. The doctors say he can probably go home tomorrow." Home. Bob wondered what that word meant to these children, whether it carried the same weight of loss and longing that it did for him. "We wanted to give you something," Grace piped up, her voice small but determined. She held out a piece of paper, folded multiple times and decorated with crayon drawings of what appeared to be flowers and rainbows. Bob accepted the paper carefully, unfolding it with the reverence of someone handling ancient manuscripts. Inside, in 7 different handwritings ranging from Emma's careful cursive to Grace's wobbly block letters, was a thank you note. "Dear Mr. Bob," it began. "Thank you for saving us from the scary place. You are a hero. We hope you are not sad anymore. Love, Emma, Lucas, Sophia, Jacob, Lily, Noah, and Grace." Bob stared at the words, feeling something crack open in his chest. "How did you know I was sad?" Emma shrugged with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd seen too much. "You have sad eyes. Like us before we met you." Before Bob could respond, Janet Morrison appeared in the doorway with another woman Bob didn't recognize. This newcomer was younger, with kind eyes and the sort of practical clothing that suggested she spent her time chasing after children. "Mr. Mitchell, I'd like you to meet Dr. Elena Rodriguez. She's been treating the children." Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mr. Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. What you did yesterday, finding these children, it was nothing short of miraculous." Bob shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip. "I just happened to be in the right place. Perhaps. But there's something I wanted to discuss with you, if you have a moment." They stepped into the hallway, leaving the children with Janet Morrison. Dr. Rodriguez led him to a small consultation room and closed the door behind them. "The children have been through significant trauma," she began. "Not just from being trapped underground, but from whatever circumstances led to them being in state care in the first place. They're remarkably resilient, but they're also vulnerable." Bob nodded, unsure where this was leading. "They formed an attachment to you. It's not uncommon for rescued children to fixate on their savior, but this feels different. Emma especially seems to see you as some kind of protector figure." "What are you saying?" Dr. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying Bob with the careful attention of someone used to reading between the lines. "I'm saying that these children need stability, and right now, you represent safety to them. The question is whether you're prepared for that responsibility." "I don't understand," They have caseworkers, foster families. I'm just the guy who found them. Actually, that's more complicated than you might think. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several screens. The children were being transported to what was supposed to be a long-term placement, but that fell through after their disappearance. The foster family, understandably, couldn't wait indefinitely. Right now, they're essentially homeless within the system. Bob felt something cold settle in his stomach. What does that mean? It means they'll likely be split up, placed in whatever emergency beds are available. Emma and Grace might stay together, but the others, she shrugged helplessly. The system is overwhelmed. Keeping 7 siblings together is nearly impossible under the best circumstances. They're siblings? Not biologically, but they've been together for over a year. In every way that matters, they're a family. Breaking them up now, after what they've just been through, would be devastating. Bob stared at the floor, processing this information. 7 children who'd already lost everything, now facing separation from each other. It felt like a cruelty too pointed to be accidental. Here is another option, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. Bob looked up to find her watching him with careful intensity. Emergency foster placement. If someone were willing to take all 7 children temporarily, just until we could find a more permanent solution. Someone like me, the children trust you. They feel safe with you. And frankly, Mr. Mitchell, you have something most emergency placements don't have. What's that? Space. Your farm could accommodate 7 children. And time. You're not juggling other foster children or working a demanding job. Bob thought about his empty house, about the rooms that had stood unused since Sarah and Tommy died, about the silence that filled every corner and the way even his own footsteps echoed like accusations. I don't know anything about taking care of children. I mean, I had a son, but 7 kids. You'd have support. Caseworkers, medical staff, counselors. And the children, they're remarkably self-sufficient. They've had to be. Bob stood up, needing to move, to think. Through the window, he could see his truck in the hospital parking lot, could see the road that led back to his farm and his empty house, and his carefully planned ending that seemed to belong to someone else now. Can I think about it? Of course, but Mr. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you. We're running out of options. If we can't find a placement soon, they'll have to be separated. And children who've been through what they've been through, separation trauma can undo months or years of healing. Back in the family room, the children were playing a board game with Janet Morrison, their voices creating a warm buzz of normalcy that felt alien in the sterile hospital environment. Bob watched them for a moment, noting how Emma kept checking to make sure all the others were accounted for, how Grace stayed close to Lily, how Lucas helped Jacob with his game pieces. They moved like a unit, like a family that had been forged by necessity and trauma into something unbreakable. The idea of splitting them up felt like watching someone tear apart a carefully constructed house of cards. Emma looked up and saw him watching. She said something to the others, then got up and walked over to where he stood. "Are you okay, Mr. Bob? You look worried." "I'm fine. Just thinking." Emma studied his face with the unsettling directness of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for her own survival. "Are you thinking about us?" The question caught Bob off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "Because that's the look grown-ups get when they're deciding if they want to keep us or not." The casual way she said it, the matter-of-fact acceptance of rejection, hit Bob harder than any tears or pleading could have. This child, this 12-year-old girl, had already learned that love was conditional, that families were temporary, that the adults responsible for her care might decide at any moment that she and her makeshift siblings were too much trouble. "Emma," Bob said carefully, "what would you think if I told you that you and the others might have to be split up?" Her face went very still, very careful. "We've been split up before. We always find each other again." But what if you didn't have to be? What if there was a way for all of you to stay together? Emma's eyes sharpened, and Bob could see her mind working, calculating possibilities and probabilities with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to hope too much. What kind of way? Bob knelt down so he was at her eye level. What would you think about coming to stay at my farm? All of you, together, at least for a while? For a moment, Emma's careful composure cracked, and Bob could see the child beneath. The premature responsibility. Hope flickered across her face, quickly followed by wariness. You mean like foster care? Something like that. Temporarily, until they can find you a permanent place. Emma looked back at the other children, then at Bob. Would we have our own rooms? If you wanted them. The house is big enough. Could we help with the farm? I'm good at taking care of animals. Bob thought about his empty barn, about the chickens he'd stopped feeding months ago, about the garden Sarah had loved that now grew nothing but weeds. There's plenty of work for anyone who wants it. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious with the weight of decision-making that should have belonged to adults. Finally she spoke. Can I talk to the others? Bob nodded and watched as Emma gathered the other children into a huddle. Their voices dropped to whispers, and he could see the rapid-fire discussion of children who'd learned to make collective decisions for their own survival. Janet Morrison and Dr. Rodriguez appeared beside him, watching the impromptu family meeting with professional interest. They're deciding whether to trust you, Dr. Rodriguez observed. Should they? That's not for me to say. But Mr. Mitchell, these children have been disappointed by adults more times than kids their age should have to count. If you take them in even temporarily, you become responsible for more than just their physical care. You become responsible for their ability to trust again. The children's huddle broke apart, and Emma approached with the others trailing behind her like ducklings. Following their mother, we talked about it, she announced. And we want to come stay with you. But we have some conditions. Bob had to suppress a smile. Conditions? We stay together no matter what. If someone wants to adopt just one or two of us, we all go, or none of us go. That seems reasonable. And we pull our own weight. We're not babies. We can work. And we want to help. Bob nodded seriously. I could use the help. Emma looked at the other children, who nodded encouragingly. And if you decide you don't want us anymore, you have to give us warning. No just dropping us off somewhere without telling us first. The condition hit Bob like a physical blow. The idea that these children had been abandoned without warning, that they'd learned to negotiate for basic dignity in their displacement, made him understand something about the kind of world they'd been living in. Emma, he said quietly, I can promise you that if things don't work out, we'll talk about it first, all of us together. No surprises. Emma studied his face for a long moment, then extended her small hand. Deal? Bob shook her hand solemnly. Deal. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward with her tablet already in hand. Well then, it looks like we have some paperwork to do. The Mitchell farmhouse had been quiet for 8 months, its rooms holding only dust and memories. Now, as Bob pulled his truck into the driveway with 7 children in the back of Janet Morrison's van following behind him, the silence felt different, expectant, maybe. Like the house itself was holding its breath. Bob sat in his truck for a moment after turning off the engine, looking at the home he'd shared with Sarah and Tommy. The white paint was peeling around the window frames, and the porch steps creaked under even his weight these days. It wasn't much to offer, but it was what he had. The van doors slid open, and the children climbed out with the careful movements of people entering foreign territory. They stood in a loose cluster near the vehicle, taking in the sprawling farmhouse, the red barn in the distance, the endless fields that stretched toward the horizon. Bob could see them processing this new environment, cataloging escape routes and safe spaces with the unconscious efficiency of those who'd learned that safety was always temporary, Emma stepped forward first, as she always seemed to. "It's big," she said, and Bob couldn't tell if that was good or bad in her estimation. Bigger than it needs to be these days. Bob climbed out of his truck and gestured toward the house. "Come on, let me show you around." The front door stuck slightly as he pushed it open, swollen from the autumn humidity. The entryway smelled like closed-up spaces and the lingering ghost of Sarah's lavender soap. Bob flicked on the lights, illuminating hardwood, floors that hadn't seen regular cleaning in months, and furniture covered with a fine layer of neglect. The children filed in behind him, their footsteps muffled. On the worn carpet, Bob watched them take in the living room with its oversized fireplace and family photos still displayed on the mantelpiece. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but he could see them cataloging details, the couch that could seat all of them, the television that actually worked, the bookshelves lined with volumes that suggested this was a house where reading mattered. "The kitchen's through here," Bob said, leading them down the hallway. "You're welcome to anything in the refrigerator or pantry. If there's something you need that I don't have, just let me know." The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a large table that Sarah had insisted they buy when Tommy was born, dreaming of future family dinners and homework sessions. It had been too big for 3 people, and after the accident, Bob had eaten his solitary meal standing at the counter. Now looking at 7 children scattered around the space, he realized Sarah had been planning for something she couldn't have known would happen. Grace wandered over to the window above the sink, standing on her tiptoes to peer out at the backyard. "There's chickens," she announced with the first real excitement Bob had heard from any of them. "Used to be more of them," Bob admitted. "I haven't been taking the best care of things lately." "We could help," Lucas offered quietly. "Emma knows about chickens. Her foster family before had some." Bob looked at Emma, who shrugged with studied casualness. "I like taking care of them. They're easier than people." There was a story there, Bob realized. Probably several stories, one for each child, explaining how they'd ended up in the system and what they'd learned along the way. But those stories would come in time if they chose to share them. "Let me show you the upstairs," he said. The second floor had 5 bedrooms, including the master bedroom that Bob hadn't been able to bring himself to change since Sarah's death. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her book still sat on the nightstand, her pillow still held the faint scent of her shampoo. He led the children past that closed door without comment. "This was my son's room," Bob said, opening the door to Tommy's bedroom. The space was frozen in time like a museum exhibit. Baseball posters on the walls, toy trucks lined up on the shelves, a half-finished Lego castle on the desk. Bob had meant to pack these things away, but every time he'd tried, he'd found reasons to put it off. The children peered into the room with the reverence of those entering a shrine. None of them stepped inside, seeming to understand instinctively that this space was sacred, untouchable. "What happened to him?" Jacob asked with the directness of childhood. "Car accident," Bob said simply. "He and my wife both." Emma shot Jacob a sharp look, but Bob held up a hand. "It's okay. It happened 8 months ago." They were coming home from baseball practice. The children absorbed this information with the solemn understanding of those who knew about loss. No one offered empty platitudes or awkward sympathy. They simply nodded and waited for him to continue. Bob showed them the other bedrooms, explaining that they could choose who roomed with whom and how they wanted to arrange things. The house had enough space for each child to have their own room if they wanted, but he suspected they'd prefer to stay close to each other, at least at first. "There are clean sheets in the linen closet," he said, opening doors and flipping on lights. "Towels in the bathroom. The hot water heater takes a few minutes to warm up, so be patient with it." They moved through the house like ghosts, touching nothing, disturbing nothing, as if afraid that too much enthusiasm might make the offer disappear. Bob understood the feeling. Good things, in their experience, were probably fragile and easily lost. By the time Janet Morrison had finished the paperwork and driven away, afternoon was fading into evening. Bob found the children in the living room, sitting close together on the couch and chairs, speaking in the low voices of people who'd learned that privacy was a luxury they couldn't count on. "You hungry?" he asked, realizing he had no idea what 7 children ate or how much food it would take to feed them. Emma looked around at the others, then back at Bob. "We're used to eating whatever's available. We're not picky." Bob thought about his own recent eating habits, the half-hearted sandwiches and microwave dinners of a man who'd forgotten that food could be more than fuel. "How about we order some pizza? Get settled in tonight. Worry about grocery shopping tomorrow." The suggestion caused a visible relaxation in the group. Pizza was safe, familiar, the universal language of childhood comfort food. While they waited for the delivery, Bob watched the children begin to explore more freely. Grace discovered the basket of magazines beside Sarah's favorite chair. Lucas found the chess set Bob had taught Tommy to play with. Sophia gravitated toward the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines with the longing of a true reader. Noah, who'd been released from the hospital that afternoon with an inhaler and strict instructions about monitoring his breathing, curled up in the corner of the couch and simply watched. He was the quietest of the group, and Bob found himself paying special attention to the boy's breathing, alert for any signs of distress. The pizza arrived just as full darkness settled over the farm. Bob spread the boxes out on the kitchen table, and for the first time since arriving, the children's careful composure cracked slightly. They were, after all, just kids, and kids got excited about pizza. "This is really good," Grace announced around a mouthful of cheese. "Better than the cafeteria at the group home," Jacob added, then looked stricken, as if he'd revealed something. He wasn't supposed to. "You don't have to be careful about what you say," Bob told him gently. "This isn't a test. You can talk about wherever you've been before." Emma studied Bob's face with those old beyond her years eyes. "Most foster parents don't want to hear about the other places. They want you to pretend like their house is the only one you've ever known. Well, I'm not most foster parents. I'm just a guy with a big house who happened to find you in his field." Something shifted in the atmosphere around the table. A subtle easing of tension that Bob felt more than saw. Lily, who hadn't spoken much since leaving the hospital, suddenly piped up. "Will you tell us about your son? The one whose room we saw?" Bob paused with a slice of pizza halfway to his mouth. "What do you want to know? Was he nice? Did he like baseball?" Bob found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. He loved baseball. Played shortstop for the Cedar Valley Little League. He was terrible at it. Couldn't hit a curveball to save his life, but he loved being on the team. "Did he help you with the farm?" Lucas asked. "He tried. Mostly he just got in the way and asked a million questions. But he was learning." Bob looked around the table at 7 faces watching him intently. His name was Tommy. He was 8 years old, and he wanted to be a veterinarian when he grew up, so he could take care of all the animals on the farm. "What was your wife like?" Emma asked softly. Bob was quiet for a moment, surprised to find that talking about Sarah didn't bring the usual wave of crushing grief. Instead, he felt something warmer, more like gratitude for having known her at all. "Sarah was the strongest person I ever met. She could fix anything that broke, cook for an army without breaking a sweat, and she never met a stray animal she wouldn't bring home." Tommy got his love of animals from her. "She sounds nice," Grace said. "She was. She would have liked all of you." After dinner, the children scattered to explore their new surroundings more thoroughly. Bob found Emma in Sarah's garden, standing among the weeds and examining the remains of what had once been carefully tended vegetable beds. "It was beautiful once," Bob said, joining her among the overgrown tomato plants. "It could be again." Emma knelt down and pulled a handful of weeds from around a struggling pepper plant. Gardens just need attention. They don't stay broken forever. Bob watched her work, noting the careful way she handled the plants, the instinctive knowledge of what belonged and what didn't. You really do know about gardening. Mrs. Chen, my foster mom before the group home, she taught me. She said plants are easier to understand than people because they always tell you what they need. What happened with Mrs. Chen? Emma's hands stilled in the dirt. Her husband got sick, cancer. They couldn't take care of foster kids anymore. She looked up at Bob. It wasn't because of anything we did wrong. Sometimes good things just end. The simple acceptance in her voice broke something open in Bob's chest. This child had learned to process loss with a maturity that most adults struggled to achieve. Emma, he said carefully, I want you to know that you're safe here. All of you, for as long as you need to be. She studied his face in the growing darkness. People say that a lot. But things change. Situations change. You're right. Things do change, but some things don't. Like the fact that you saved my life yesterday, just as much as I saved yours. Emma frowned. We didn't save your life. You saved ours. Bob was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of the other children's voices drifting from the house, to the familiar night sounds of his farm coming to life around them. Before I found you, I was planning to give up. On everything. The farm, my life, all of it. Finding you changed that. Gave me something to fight for again. Emma's eyes widened as she processed this information. You mean you were going to... I was in a very dark place. But 7 voices calling for help pulled me out of it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Emma continuing to pull weeds while Bob simply enjoyed the presence of another person in Sarah's garden. In the distance, he could hear Lucas and Jacob discussing something with animated enthusiasm. Could see Grace and Lily playing with one of the barn cats on the porch. Mr. Bob? Emma's voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah? What if we mess this up? What if we're too much trouble? Bob looked at this 12-year-old girl who'd somehow become responsible for 6 other children, who'd learned to negotiate for basic dignity and plan for disappointment. Emma, you want to know what I've learned about trouble? The worst kind isn't the kind that comes from outside. It's the kind that comes from having nothing left to care about. You've given me something to care about again. That's not trouble. That's salvation. That night, Bob lay in his own bed listening to the sounds of a house full of children. Whispered conversations floating down the hallway. The creak of floorboards as someone got up for a glass of water. The soft closing of a door. For 8 months, the house had been silent except for his own footsteps and the settling of old wood. Now it was alive again, full of the particular energy that only children could bring. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have made of this situation. She would have already been planning breakfast for 7 kids, would have been measuring windows for curtains to make the spare bedrooms feel more homelike. She would have seen the potential in these children immediately, would have known instinctively how to help them heal. Bob didn't have Sarah's intuitive understanding of children's needs, but he had something else. He had time and space, and his own understanding of what it meant to lose everything and have to start over. Maybe that would be enough. Sometime after midnight, he heard his bedroom door creak open. In the dim light from the hallway, he could see a small figure silhouetted in the doorway. Mr. Bob? It was Grace's voice, small and uncertain. What's wrong, sweetheart? I had a bad dream about the dark place. Bob sat up, suddenly alert. Come here. Grace padded across the room in her bare feet and climbed onto the edge of the bed. In the dim light, he could see that she'd been crying. Want to tell me about it? Grace shook her head, then changed her mind and nodded. I dreamed we were back in the hole, but this time nobody found us. We just stayed there forever and ever. Bob felt his heart clench. But somebody did find you. You're safe now. But what if it happens again? What if bad people come and put us somewhere else? Bob looked down at this 6-year-old child who'd learned to fear the dark and the confined spaces and the possibility that safety was always temporary. "Grace, can I tell you a secret?" She nodded solemnly. "I'm scared too. I'm scared that I won't know how to take care of all of you properly. I'm scared that I'll mess up and you'll get hurt. But you know what I've learned about being scared?" "What?" "Being scared means you care about something. And caring about something is what makes people fight to protect it. I care about you and Emma and all the others. So I'm going to fight to keep you safe, even if I'm scared while I'm doing it." Grace considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd been forced to think about adult concepts long before she should have had to. "Can I stay here tonight, in case the bad dreams come back?" Bob thought about all the reasons this might not be appropriate, about what Janet Morrison would say about proper boundaries between foster parents and children. Then he looked at Grace's tear-streaked face and made a decision based on nothing more than the fact that she was scared and he could help. "Of course you can stay, but just for tonight, okay?" Grace curled up on the far side of the bed, as small and self-contained as possible. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of childhood sleep. Bob lay awake for a long time after that, listening to Grace's quiet breathing and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, he'd been a man with nothing left to lose. Now he was responsible for 7 children who'd already lost everything and were trusting him not to let them down. It should have terrified him. Instead, as he finally drifted off to sleep, Bob Mitchell felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 months. He felt needed. And for the first time since the accident, that felt like enough. 3 weeks after the children arrived, Bob stood in his kitchen watching 7 kids demolish a breakfast that would have fed his family for a week. The sound of their chatter filled corners of the house that had been silent for so long he'd forgotten they could hold noise. Emma was organizing everyone's school supplies with military precision. Lucas was explaining the finer points of chicken care to Noah, whose breathing had improved dramatically in the clean farm air. Grace was drawing pictures of the barn cats, each one labeled with names she'd assigned them. This wasn't supposed to be permanent. Janet Morrison reminded him of that fact during her weekly visits, clipboard in hand, checking off boxes that measured the children's adjustment and his competency as a caregiver. Emergency placement, she called it. Temporary guardianship until a more suitable arrangement could be found. But watching Sophia help Jacob with his reading homework, seeing Lily teach Grace how to braid friendship bracelets, Bob realized that some things couldn't be measured on forms or explained in case reports. Some things just were. The farm was coming back to life too. The children had thrown themselves into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including Bob. Emma had proven to be a natural with the animals, coaxing the neglected chickens back to health and somehow convincing them to start laying again. Lucas had revealed an aptitude for mechanical things, helping Bob fix equipment that had been gathering dust in the barn. Even the smallest ones found ways to contribute, Grace collecting eggs with the seriousness of someone entrusted with great responsibility. Sarah's garden was thriving under Emma's careful attention. The girl spent hours among the plants, talking to them in low voices as she weeded and watered. Bob often found himself watching her from the kitchen window, remembering how Sarah used to move through those same rows with identical care and devotion. The foreclosure notice still sat on his desk, but next to it now were school enrollment forms and medical records and permission slips for field trips. The bank had granted him an extension when Janet Morrison explained his situation, though Bob suspected Dr. Rodriguez's letter about the therapeutic value of stability for the children had carried more weight than his own financial projections. Bob had started sleeping through the night again. The nightmares about Sarah and Tommy hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd been joined by dreams about harvest festivals and school plays, and Christmas mornings filled with the kind of chaos that only children could create. Dreams that felt less like wishful thinking and more like plans. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Grace appeared at his bedroom door. Not because of nightmares this time, but because she'd heard one of the barn cats crying and wanted to check on it. Bob found her in the barn at dawn, cradling a tiny kitten that had somehow gotten separated from its mother. "She's hungry," Grace announced with the authority of someone who understood abandonment. "She needs us to take care of her." Bob looked at this 6-year-old girl holding a scrap of orange fur, both of them small and vulnerable, and somehow fierce in their determination to survive. "What do you think we should name her?" "Hope," Grace said without hesitation. "Because that's what you gave us." That afternoon, Bob called Janet Morrison and asked about adoption procedures. Not emergency placement or temporary guardianship, adoption, real and permanent and legal. "Mr. Mitchell," Janet said carefully, "that's a big step. 7 children is a significant commitment." "I know what it is," Bob replied, watching through his window as Emma taught the younger kids how to identify different types of clouds. "It's a family." The paperwork took months. Home studies and background checks and interviews with social workers who seemed perpetually surprised that a middle-aged widower wanted to adopt 7 children who weren't related to him by blood. Bob answered their questions with the patience of someone who'd learned that the best things in life were worth fighting for. The children waded through the process with the careful hope of those who'd learned not to expect too much too quickly. They didn't talk about it directly, but Bob could see them watching him for signs that he might change his mind, might decide that 7 kids were too much trouble after all. The day the final papers were signed, Bob gathered all 7 children in the living room where he'd first shown them around 3 months earlier. The house looked different now, lived in and loved. Walls decorated with school artwork and report cards and photos from their first harvest festival. "I have something to tell you," Bob began, then found himself struggling with words that suddenly seemed inadequate for what he wanted to say. Emma, as always, read the situation with uncanny accuracy. "Is it about the adoption papers?" Bob nodded, pulling the documents from the manila envelope. "As of today, if you want it, this is your home, not temporarily. Not until something better comes along. Forever." The silence that followed was different from the careful quiet of their early days. This was the silence of people processing joy, of children who'd stopped believing in forever, suddenly discovering it was real. Grace spoke first, her voice small but certain. "Does this mean we don't have to worry about being split up anymore?" "Never again," Bob promised. Noah, who'd been the quietest throughout the whole process, suddenly burst into tears. Not sad tears, but the overwhelmed sobs of someone who'd been holding their breath for so long they'd forgotten how to exhale. Lily threw her arms around Bob's neck, and then they were all there, 7 children and 1 middle-aged farmer creating the kind of pile of humanity that spoke louder than any legal document ever could. That evening, Bob stood on his porch watching his children play in the yard, where Tommy had once thrown baseballs and Sarah had hung laundry on summer afternoons. The ghosts were still there, would always be there, but they'd been joined by new voices and new laughter and new memories being written in real time. Emma approached, holding baby Hope in her arms. The kitten had grown into a confident young cat who seemed to understand that she was part of something important. "Mr. Bob?" Emma said, using the name that had stuck despite his repeated invitations to call him Dad. "Thank you for choosing us." Bob looked at this remarkable girl who'd somehow kept 6 other children alive through trauma and uncertainty, who'd learned to hope and trust again despite every reason not to. "Emma," he said quietly, "I think you've got it backwards. You chose me that day in the field when you called for help. You chose me to be part of your family. I'm the one who should be grateful." As the sun set over the Nebraska farmland, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Bob Mitchell understood something he'd never expected to learn. Family wasn't just about blood or law or circumstances. It was about choosing to show up for each other, day after day, in all the ordinary moments that added up to a life. The Mitchell farm was full again, not just with the sound of children's voices, but with the particular energy of people who'd found where they belonged. And for the first time since that terrible day 8 months ago, Bob could imagine Sarah and Tommy looking down and smiling at what their family had become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.